good morning, everybody. Welcome back to some of you who might feel as though you spent your entire life in this building over the last 3 days, but you're very welcome. So we wanted to take the chance of having so many people together this week to talk a little bit about UK sanctions strategy. We talked a lot about sanctions at the conference yesterday. We heard from the EU sanctions envoy, David O'Sullivan. We heard from John's colleague, Dan Tannenbaum, from he's over there, from the US, about sort of some views from that side of the Atlantic. But something happened in February last year, and I'm going to immediately be corrected by David. David Reed, you're very welcome, as ever, here at RUSI, Director of the Sanctions Directorate at the FCDO, because we called this event UK Sanctions Strategy 1 year on. You may or may not have noticed there was an election in this country last year. So technically, it's sort of just a UK sanctions document that was published in February last year by the previous government, but it is 1 year since it came out. So we thought we would just go with UK Sanctions Strategy 1 year on. So you're very welcome to join us this morning, David. And I already mentioned John Harvey, who's the European Head of Anti-Financial Crime at Oliver Wyman and knows plenty about sanctions as well. Allison Mackenzie, thank you very much for joining us as Group Head of Sanctions from HSBC. And then the sonic screwdriver of sanctions, Cina, who's a Senior Associate Fellow for our team here at RUSI. Sorry if you don't get the sonic screwdriver reference, please go and watch Doctor Who. But Chloe has a sort of a background in government, in banking, and in law when it comes to sanctions, so hence the reference. So we'll have a conversation about the strategy to start with. So David, maybe we could begin with you. You arrived in the Sanctions Directorate in mid-2023?
2.5 years ago.
2.5 years ago. And at some point, someone had the idea of writing a strategy. So sort of what was the reason for doing that, and what did you hope to achieve?
So thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. It's always a pleasure to be here at RUSI, and particularly in this room. So rewinding, 2.5, 3 years, I think the scale of the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in terms of sanctions was something pretty extraordinary. It was extraordinary in terms of the scope of the measures we brought into place. It was extraordinary in terms of the scale and speed at which we did it, and it was pretty extraordinary in terms of the level of international coordination. I think your framing of the strategy was very fair, Tom. We've had an election between hand, and the strategy itself is published under a foreword by David Cameron. But I think a lot of the principles in the strategy remain in place. So maybe just rewinding and thinking a little bit about sort of the reasoning for publishing. I think we moved at a pace and a speed in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which really stretched the system. And one of the things we were focused on in the first year and a half or so after the invasion was making sure that we had the right architecture in place, that we had really clear roles and responsibilities across government. And I think one of the things that the strategy helpfully did, both for a national audience, and I think it was pitched principally at a high level as a non-practitioner level, but also for an international audience, was to set out exactly who does what on sanctions, because it's complicated. In terms of the overall strategy and targeting led by the FCDO, and then you have a range of government departments and law enforcement agencies responsible for enforcement. So that was the first thing, just make it really clear who does what. The second thing, I think, was to try and consolidate some of the things that we learnt through our experience in relation to Russia, and set out some principles for when we use sanctions, but probably more importantly, when we don't use sanctions. Sanctions are a really attractive tool. They are something that is often reached for in response to a crisis, but they won't always be the right tool. And I think what the strategy tried to do was set out some guidelines and principles, and it included things like the basis for what successful sanctions looks like. I think one of the things we were really clear on was it's much better to have a clear set of objectives, be clear about what you're trying to achieve, and ensure that you're using sanctions as part of a much bigger toolkit. So in the context of Russia, for example, we're trying to do two specific things. One is reduce the amount of money that Russia has to wage war. And the second is put as much grit as possible into Russia's military supply chain. So this is very much in the disrupt and constrain space. But that's part of a broader strategy that goes alongside economic support to Ukraine, military support to Ukraine, and the diplomatic side. Another broad principle is around sanctions work best when coordinated with partners. I think there was a really good podcast I think Liz Rosenberg did with you, Tom, about a year ago, which talked about how partners have worked on sanctions. And she just left the US Treasury, so she was very free to express her views. And I think she talked a bit about sort of dynamic alignment, about in most cases, it makes sense to act together within the sanctioning coalition, and there'll be times where it's absolutely essential to move simultaneously. So thinking about some of the actions that the UK and the US took on metals exchanges or against the Moscow Stock Exchange last year, that was really important to act simultaneously. Other times, it will be possible for one country to move a little bit ahead of others. And I think the Shadow Fleet, I think, is a good example last year where the UK pushed ahead, and that made sense given our expertise of our maritime services industry. And I think it helps encourage others, including the EU and the US, to ramp up pressure there. We might get on in a second to some of the impact of that. But there'll be times where we move simultaneously, times where we deliberately move at slightly different paces, and sometimes we will actually not be able to move at the same speed because of either different legal criteria or different political equities. So the principle of sort of international coordination and how that worked. And then I think the sort of third thing was around unintended consequences and how we should operate to ensure that we are doing more harm to our adversary than to our own economies, which is clearly a sort of critical factor in our planning. And if I'm allowed to be a little bit self-critical, I would say we've got better at engaging with industry and experts ahead of designing measures. But I think there's a sliding scale, and I would put probably at the top of that scale, so oil price cap and the work on metals exchanges, where I think there was some really good engagement, which helped ensure that we delivered exactly the effect we wanted and we had the mitigations in place. But there are other examples where we should have engaged earlier and in more detail with business. I won't go into those now, but I think that's a sort of learning point from us. So sort of putting it all together, I think the strategy was basically trying to set out some key principles, be clear on who does what, be clear on when we don't use sanctions, and also set out a couple of the longer term challenges for us. We're in the middle of a review of our sanctions architecture, particularly with a focus on compliance and deterrence. And there we're looking at, for example, how we get better at dealing with circumvention ahead of time. One of the challenges for us has also been managing legal risk, and that's where I think we've got a really good story to tell with 9 successive court victories. So that's a sort of long way of saying that was the principle of the strategy. We may get into a second in terms of where sort of the new government is focused, but I think a lot of those principles in that strategy hold true.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, I remember at the time being emphasized to me that it was sort of a stock take, I think was the word that was used. I suppose one thing was also emphasized to me, because I was like, oh, it's very long. It's like 30 something pages. No. It's only 10 pages with pictures. And so just thinking about that for a second, because obviously sanctions have been in the public eye in a way that they had not been before before February 2022, when you have sort of people on the terraces at Chelsea chanting in favor of Roman Abramovich, you realize that sanctions are definitely in the public eye. So I mean, to what extent do you see from your chair at the FCDO any kind of like engagement with the sanctions topic from the broader public? Yes, industry are important, but obviously there's also a broader public out there as well.
So I would say in the UK, I think public support for sanctions has stayed fairly steady and strong over the last 3 years or so. But I think there is, as you'd expect, a real sort of sliding scale in terms of level of understanding of what sanctions are for, what they can do, what they can't do. Again, sort of looking back, I think some of the language around sort of what sanctions could achieve on Russia in the first few weeks post-invasion was potentially a little bit overstated. I think sanctions by their nature have an impact that compounds over time. They take time to deliver. I think David O'Sullivan, he may have used it yesterday, but I think he likes using the analogy of the bike tire, where you are puncturing it and the air slowly goes out. I think we're at the time now where the air is pretty much out of that tire, actually, and we can get onto that in a second. But I think the sense that you will sort of immediately collapse the Russian economy was perhaps a bit strong. I would say one of the things that we are trying to do is also explain how sanctions can deliver unintended consequences, and we have a responsibility within government to identify those consequences ahead of time and where possible mitigate those. So looking back again over the last 2.5 years, potentially around things like food security, on energy security, I think it was really important to explain what we were doing and how we were building in mitigation safeguards to avoid, for example, a spike in global oil prices or avoid blockages in fertilizer exports, and also just explain that we are not targeting the Russian people here. We are deliberately designing sanctions to allow, for example, pharmaceuticals and humanitarian products to continue to be traded, but we are targeted in terms of what we're trying to hit.
Yeah, as David reminded us on the panel yesterday, we shouldn't be saying that sanctions created food price spikes or oil price spikes. It's the Russian invasion of Ukraine that introduced that. So the other thing I was told when the report came out was, well, it wasn't written for people like you, Tom. So was it written for people like the banking sector, Allison? What do these kinds of documents mean for an organisation like yours?
Okay. Thank you. I think David won't mind. I would say that the strategy from a banking perspective wasn't particularly groundbreaking. So I don't think there was anything in there that either, as I said, was groundbreaking or helped us in terms of sanctions implementation from a banking perspective. That said, I think the document, it is great to have a formal document that sets out what the government's current and future sanctions priorities are. It's always easier to implement a program if you know why you're implementing it and what the policy objectives are behind that. I think the document is useful, particularly probably outside of the financial sector in many ways, and businesses and individuals that are seeking to understand sanctions and apply them more broadly, to give that document as to what is the policy behind that, what is the approach, what's the decision-making process that government goes through, what is the licensing process that government goes through. So I think it was a good document. Did it change the way that we operate? No, but I think it is a useful document. I think when you look at guidance from the financial sector, we would more look to OFSI through specific guidance in relation to how you implement particular programs or their FAQs that they now issue. So I think that's where industry, or financial sector anyway, would look to.
And there is obviously a lot of that guidance available, and obviously colleagues aren't here to speak for themselves. But how are we doing on that front?
I think we'll touch on that a bit later in one of the questions we come to. I think some of the guidance is good, some of the guidance is not. I think there's areas where industry, and I will speak about this a bit later, needs guidance, and we can spend several years talking about the subject and not getting the guidance. And if you don't have guidance in certain areas, then the private sector will fill in the gaps for themselves, and then you end up with inconsistency.
Okay. So John, you and your colleagues spend a lot of time, Oliver Wyman, talking to clients and so on about the challenges. So maybe you could just give us an overview of the key challenges that you heard about in that sort of post Feb 22 period.
Absolutely. Good morning. I'm going to go back, if I may. I will come back to 22, but I think there's a fundamental shift around the first invasion in 2014, and I think the introduction of sector-specific sanctions was where the world changed for me and how we were doing things. I was in Cyprus at the time explaining to a bank why they shouldn't be shipping water pumps that were capable of going deeper than 100 meters and moving a certain volume of fluid. And it was the first time that a sanctions department had not dealt with a regime which is this person is blocked, don't let him travel, freezes funds, no transactions, which is how it used to be. And then looking at prohibitions like this and targeting sectors, it shifted. But thankfully, that only affected a limited number of firms that were in specific areas. If I come forward now to the introduction of the UK's response, just before the recent strategy, the global banks had mature programs and were able to respond to things in infinitely better ways than the smaller players. And one of the things that's interesting about your question with international institutions is that the UK strategy was very much domestic, but connected to the coalition. And from the UK's perspective, you're looking at UK institutions, obviously, and respecting the coalition. But the firms, the international firms, are complying with lots of other jurisdictions' regulations. And that's where the complexity gets introduced for a lot of them, because everything from the definition of beneficial ownership to control and so on, and not sharing intelligence about who the individuals are behind all these activities and so on, it is where it starts to get ratcheted up in terms of complexity. What does firms struggle with? I think it started with the risk assessment and the sanctions risk assessment, because the availability of data. It started in part with what are the goals? What is it we're trying to achieve with this? Now, we spoke with a lot of sectors last year as part of some work we did, everything from charities to financial services firms and so on. And there's this, if you tell us what you want to achieve, we'll explain to you how to do it. And everybody was trying to do the right thing, but it was the complexity of how to comply that they struggled with. And I'll give one example, which was securities. If you look at certain securities that are restricted in the UK, but they're not in the US, or the other way around, and the action you can take with the security. So what's the difference between a short-term, rollover 1 month security versus an institution would say, okay, well, we'll close it down, cash out after 28 days, then move back into it later. It's circumvention. No, it was permissible. So the complexity was massive, ratcheted up, and that's where people struggled with it.
So the devil is in the detail. To what extent do you think, I'm asking you to speculate now, but to what extent do you think that therefore that impacts the kind of effectiveness? Because we all talk about the effectiveness of sanctions all the time. Are we achieving our objectives? There's an efficient frontier in there somewhere.
There is. I'm smiling because of having spoke with John Cusack last night again, which is all about effectiveness. But design effectiveness is typically where we would work with a client, designing something to be compliant. But operating effectiveness is where this starts to become challenging, because do you have sufficient resources? Do you have the data feeds? Do you have the people? Are they trained? Do you understand the risks? And are your controls functioning as you anticipated? So effectiveness is key. But if we go back to my previous answer about the risk assessment, is your risk assessment, your understanding of risk and your compliance obligations timely? Are you responding to it? And do you have assurance that it's working? And is the board being given the information they need to know what the obligations are, so that they can provide appropriate resources to maintain your compliant program?
Maybe if I could add to that as well. Actually, I think, you have seen a lot of collaboration between the US, the UK, the EU, and a number of the programs, but it's the nuances that are different between those programs that, from a bank perspective, or any entity that's trying to implement controls, it's the nuances that are really difficult to implement controls. So you often end up taking the highest standard and saying, actually, we should just not do any business in that area, or we're not going to allow trading in any of those securities, even though it's perfectly permissible from a UK perspective. So if you take secondary market trading, for example, not permissible from the US, permissible from the UK, it's hard to implement that. So you might as well just say, we're not going to do it at all. So you actually stop legitimate business. So the UK government has not asked you to stop doing something, but actually you can't implement the controls to not do it. So you over comply. So
that's a neat segue, Chloe, to you, because what I wanted to ask you about was, obviously, since Brexit, the UK's had its independent sanctions strategy, sanctions making capability, and now strategy. We obviously all know that. There's been a lot of talk, and David referenced it, and indeed on the podcast. Thank you for the name check. On the podcast that we recorded with Liz Rosenberg from US Treasury, she was at pains to stress this cooperation. But where are we now in terms of alignment, UK, EU? What challenges is that posing to the private sector on implementation?
I think the fact that we've got a strategy is groundbreaking. If I look back 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have a strategy.
Why did you not write one when you were in the Foreign Office, Chloe?
Because we were 4 lawyers in legal directorate. We didn't have really anybody. We had a secondee from the US State Department. We had a couple of policy desk officers, one for Syria, one for Libya, one couple more for Russia, and a handful for Iran. And that was really the sanctions across government. So I think the fact that we've got the strategy is great. But the strategy itself is not groundbreaking, and it needs to move on. It needs to be reviewed. In terms of alignment, I think there is an awful lot that could be done in the strategy itself to give confidence to the private sector that alignment is something that is taken seriously, not just about the foreign policy objectives themselves, but really about the implementation challenges that we face in the private sector. And I think this is what you're asking me to comment on. Sorry, is because what we found over the past few years, and in particular the past 3 years, is that yes, there may be a phenomenally sort of lockstep coordinated approach by the three main, and let's say the G7 as well, sanctioning authorities. And on paper, it all looks like we are completely aligned. But actually, when you come to, and you've just highlighted secondary market trading as one point, I don't want to step on anyone's toes. I think you're going to talk about ownership and control, but I think the professional services one is really key in terms of the waste of resources, because of the number of different sectors that have been brought into the sanctions question and in terms of implementation, but also the uncertainty because of the divergence across the three main regimes. And that's where the strategy needs to move forward. So next year, there needs to be obviously, and I'm sure there is, a review of all of the great work that has been put into this, but actually listening to the private sector and say, right, what were our foreign policy objectives? Did we achieve them? To what percentage? And how? And it's not so much Russia, because I think there's a lot of talk about, well, you know, how can we improve the Russia regime? It's actually about, well, if we were to repurpose, reuse any of these measures, and there's so many measures now that you could just pick from if you were going to, you know, introduce a new regime. Any of those measures have weaknesses, and it's about looking at how did they work in Russia? Where were those weaknesses? And what can be done to improve them if we're going to repurpose them for another regime? And I think that's really key, because that brings down the compliance costs, because it's not that UK or European companies don't want to comply. It's the amount of effort, intellectual and human resource, and sometimes emotional effort when you're talking about dealing directly with a business. You know, do you want to navigate your way through this? How much is it going to cost? What are the implications if you're a pharma company of not getting, you know, medical equipment or medicine out to a population which is vulnerable? What are those costs, and how do we actually go forward and pick up on some of those weaknesses and improve the regime so that when they are used again, they are actually effective and they're closer to achieving their foreign policy objectives?
So I want to tie something you've been saying there with a point that David made, which is that I think you said the sort of sliding scale of cooperation with the private sector in starting with, okay, what outcome do we want to achieve? Okay, oil price cap, I think everybody acknowledges there was a lot of collaboration and kind of understanding how to construct that in a way that didn't roil energy markets. So would you then argue, I mean, is there a case to say, you know, FCDO needs to sit down with sort of relevant people from industry and say, right, our objective is A, B, C. How would you, HSBC, how would you, Trafigura, or whoever it is, what levers would you ask FCDO, what levers should you be asking us to pull in order to achieve the outcome you want?
Absolutely, and you're going to get a simple answer, because it's not as if nobody wants to comply. You're going to get a simple answer. You're going to get from those that understand the technical pain points and what is required to achieve the objectives. And I think we've moved on, and I think the government should be recognised in a positive light for the amount of effort in many different areas where they've engaged. And yesterday I was asked to do some research for the Department of Business and Trade on these professional services, and I understand they're going around all the different service providers, so legal, accounting, architecture, across all of those where they face restrictions, and asking industry, you know, for their opinion. One hopes that it's going to be, you know, result in a report which is then not just stuffed in somebody's drawer in Whitehall and gathers dust over a period of time, but actually where we've made recommendations on improvement. But there's two sides to it. There's what we have in place now, and that was something like yesterday's initiative, but there's also, you know, what we can do in the future. And if we think about 10 years ago when we were talking about the arguments as to why government was scared to get out there and be a spokesperson for sanctions strategy, because it was all about asset flight. We can't let anybody know what the designations are going to be. But we don't really, we've moved on from that era. And actually these very innovative, novel, impressive new trade measures or export control regimes which merged into the sanctions programs, they are phenomenally technical, and therefore you need to have the reciprocity from both sides so that they are more effective.
So Allison, back to you then from your seat at HSBC. I mean, what have you seen particular changes you might point to in the way government has engaged with you since the strategy came out, or indeed since February 2022?
I think we're starting to see that. And I think there were some real positives for me when you read the strategy around, and we've already touched on it, but I think the real positives that came out of that was the indication of the continued, or the partnering with the private sector at the time that sanctions are either being developed or implemented. And also the aim of sort of minimizing unintended consequences of sanctions. And I think those two things are really, really positive and is a step change. And so, yes, as a bank, we do want to engage because we're the ones that then have to implement. So if we can say, look, that doesn't make sense because we cannot implement a control to do that, but we can do the following, and you can shape the way regulation is drafted. And I think that would be very good step forward.
And without betraying confidences, I mean, are there regular occasions where you're consulted? Are you never consulted? I mean, where on David's sliding scale, where do you find yourself?
No, we are consulted. I think we should be consulted more. I'll give you the example of the changes where changes to regulations, and the UK sort of added a whole heap of banks to 17A and to address what OFSI was calling trapped payments. So we're now holding a lot of cash. We're not required to freeze the cash, but we're not allowed to send it on, and we're not allowed to send it back. But we're also not allowed to report it in our frozen asset return because it's not frozen. So you kind of go, we're just looking after it nicely and putting it somewhere safe, but it makes no sense. So, that before making that change to respond to a different issue, it would have been really helpful to have engaged with us, because we could have gone through all of the operational reasons that made no sense at all.
So my sense, I'll take the spotlight off you in a second. But my sense is that the sort of the thinking about how sanctions are going to be implemented by the private sector tends to emerge in kind of FAQs after the fact rather than before they're designed. Is that a fair?
It is. I mean, I wouldn't want the UK to go down what obviously OFAC did recently, and they changed an entire regulation by an FAQ. So you want to engage, but I think you want to engage before it comes out, not after it's come out, because, if the regulation comes out and it makes no sense, you still have to respond to it because you've got a legal obligation to respond to it. You can't necessarily wait for someone to clarify what it is they asked you to do, because you can get dinged for not doing it.
So John, I want to come back to you and think about other kind of parts of the sanctions obligated community, if you like. You referred to your company in Cyprus there. I mean, there's obviously a lot of expertise in the banking sector when it comes to dealing with sanctions. I don't think we can say that about the whole of the community, which is now captured by sanctions. So first of all, maybe be interested if you give some more examples of where you've seen expertise developing, but also, what would you like to see governments, plural, do in order to help those industries comply with the obligations that the governments want them to undertake?
Okay. So the example I cited in Cyprus was quite a long time ago and with a different employee. So I'm going to use ones a lot more recent. Sorry, Dan. We've worked predominantly with financial services firms recently. And I would say that without exception, everybody is trying to comply. Something Allison just said about the risk appetite, saying, I'm going to paraphrase, about the operational rigor of being compliant, therefore it's possibly too high risk, therefore we're not doing it. And I think the question is, well, where did those clients then go? Because it's potentially permissible, but outside of your appetite. Expertise. I don't know how many people, how many firms would understand the permissibility of a transaction that HSBC turned down. I'm not sure where that expertise is unless they got professional enablers or professional gatekeepers to do those things. I think it's wrong to think financial services as one great big block. There are firms that retail, investment banks and different things, and they clearly have different expertise. Some of them have got in-house expertise to deal with the nuances of a secondary market. Is it permissible? Is it not? Therefore not. And the retail banks have got, a lot of reliance on technology, high volume, low value, screening, and so on. It's different. There isn't a single answer. I think everybody's looking at the capacity. Do they have the expertise? They're certainly growing it, and they're certainly reaching out to ask for these things. They're certainly looking for assurance, comfort. Do we understand the obligations? Can we evidence we're complying? I think one of the things that does drive increasing expertise and so on is enforcement activity. And I know, David, you may go into more detail around this, but an enforcement notice does provide an awful lot of insight into what did OSFI, what did the regulation anticipate, expect you would do? How would you handle this? And also, where were you given credit in the consequential treatment of that for your practices and things like that? So expertise, I think there's investment in expertise, there's growing capacity, there are increases in headcount, but there are also some of the tools which are doing this, and a lot of firms are innovating with the tools. We're doing some, and have done recently, some benchmarking, some more benchmarks, say how are companies responding to sanctions? Where's your headcount? How have you changed your capacity? What's the nature of capacity? Because there's obviously a view to say this is no longer one person in an office going yes, no, like an export transaction or payment screening. Expertise is also converging with export controls because, as Chloe just alluded to, a banker doing trade finance now needs to take the common high priority goods list or the weapons list and research what's an HS code, which SIC codes, NAIC codes are concerned in the manufacture, sales, distribution, leasing, shipping, servicing of. How does that correlate to my trade finance transaction? And this expert in trade finance is not, forgive me if you work in trade finance, it's not the most exciting of things. It's a paper-based thing. The innovation, the expertise needed to say, how has this servo, this gyro made its way to these people? How do we fund it and so on? You're asking the same person in that department to do it now. So expertise, they've had to grow it. They've had to reach out. They need new information resources and so on. Do they have sufficient capacity?
So you John, you joined us at a workshop that we did in Barcelona I think it was in 2023. Anyway, it was all about kind of technology in trying to address these sanctions implementation challenges. And whilst there's obviously a lot of technology that can help you screen for names and entities and so on, and as I think as Chloe said, that's we kind of know how to do that. Where are we on technology to help deal with the challenge of sectoral sanctions and activity-based sanctions implementation? Has anyone come up with the perfect solution yet?
Okay, first of all, I'm not going to endorse a product specifically, but I would say there are a lot of products that don't do it very well. And I would say that if you want to know if your product set is adequate, then you need to look at it because you should know the answer to that. You should be testing it. I was in Barcelona and it was useful to look at the tool sets and so on. And one of the things that was interesting, even though it wasn't that long time ago, there are only a very limited number of companies that provide the lists and the tools appropriate or required to screen to comply with the current regulations. So for example, with security lists, there's only one or two companies that will publish the what are they called? ISIN codes, thank you. And the ISIN codes, or the identifiers for the ISIN codes, are the short form codes or the security, the local exchange short form codes for them, or the secondary markets where they're traded, all those kind of things that you need to be compliant. I'm always minded there was an enforcement notice from OFAC and it was to do with crypto, but a firm had not identified a sanctioned person using crypto and the regulation did not say that they had to do a certain test. And I think the person had emailed in and the response is, the IP address was available to you, you should have used it. And it always stuck in my mind, and it struck me with the securities, which is, if there's a vendor that gives you this information or that's available to you or your research would have revealed to you, you should not be dealing with that party, or there are specific conditions on how you execute that trade and so on, you must have, adhered to them and applied to them. And to your question, there are a limited number of vendors, you need to test it, need assurance. If you don't have that assurance, then maybe you shouldn't be doing that.
Thank you. So David, the wonderful thing about the internet is people can read documents all over the world. And I know that obviously UK and your team and obviously have spent a lot of time engaging with EU member states, United States, and then the so-called third countries. So what sort of reception, or how has the strategy document fed into the conversations that you've had with international partners?
So again, if I look back a couple of years and thinking through some of those initial conversations with the third countries through which we saw spikes in trade to Russia, we did a lot of those conversations trilaterally with EU, US, UK. Those conversations were sometimes quite difficult to start with, and the sort of challenges that we were faced with were, why should we stop trading with Russia? You're asking us different things, EU, UK, US. Nobody else is complying with this. Why should we do this? I think that conversation's changed quite a lot over the last couple of years for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is, I think we've been really disciplined as the EU, US, UK. We've really focused on this common high priority goods list you mentioned, this sort of 50 HS codes, the stuff that Russia needs that it can't produce easily domestically, that it's struggling to source from elsewhere. And we've had that consistent ask of third countries now for a couple of years. So it's been really clear what we're asking. And it's been a really targeted ask. It has not been something which has a sort of fundamental impact on that country's economy. It is not something which is going to cause a sort of massive diminution in GDP if they introduce controls. It's a tiny percent of a percent of GDP, but it has a big impact if you can introduce controls on that. I think the other thing that's changed in those conversations has been how third countries have seen levels of compliance from partners. So there is now a bit of a benchmark in terms of what's expected in terms of introducing controls, for example, on the re-export of those common high priority goods lists. So those conversations, I think, have been quite productive for quite some time now. And I think we've seen, as a result, through both publicly available trade data and other sources, diminutions in trade from, for example, some countries in the Caucasus, some countries in Central Asia. We've seen the problem sort of move eastwards, if I can say that. But we've got a model that I think works and again, relies on us being really consistent, really disciplined, really targeted in those asks. I mean, those asks come with an offer of technical assistance as well. So you mentioned sort of guidance. A lot of that has been translated into a whole range of languages to make it easier for those countries to comply with. It comes with an offer of technical assistance. One of the things which I think has been a really good investment of time and resources, posting UK officials into third countries who can then be an expert source of advice and can build up the sort of relationships they need to maintain this positive dynamic. And we've seen the EU and others sort of move into that space as well. So I think a sort of a really targeted ask, an offer of support, and I think in some cases an ability and willingness to go after shell companies which are being used to circumvent sanctions in a proportionate, realistic way, I think has been effective. There's an awful lot more to do, but I think that would be what I would take away from those third country visits.
I should say that I spoke to a colleague of David's who said, yes, I went to Thailand with David and he left me behind. Yeah. So there's certainly, you've obviously got the network has expanded quite significantly. I mean, one of the challenges that I guess you face when it comes to sanctions discussions with third countries is that the UN Security Council is not going to be passing sanctions on this kind of topic anytime soon. And so there is a narrative of, I think it's, unilateral coercive measures, which is kind of popularized by those that feel that sanctions should only be issued by the UN Security Council, or rather only sanctions issued by the UN Security Council are valid. Does the strategy, or how does that conversation work? And does the strategy help explain to people why UK takes the approach that it takes?
So one key part in the strategy, and which remains the case today, is UN first where possible. So the ideal outcome is you have UN sanctions because of their automatic automatic application reach. Clearly, it's difficult at the moment to deliver on a number of sort of policy areas in the UN, but actually I think there are still some potential areas, and I'm hopeful in the sort of next few weeks we might see something. So you're then in the realm of coordinated autonomous sanctions. I think the sort of arguments that we would make, and I think we have evidence to back up these arguments, are that, first of all, again, we're being sort of targeted in our asks. Secondly, that we are offering support to help make those asks realistic and deliverable. Thirdly, that we are conscious of and taking steps to avoid unintended consequences of some of those measures. So I won't go into particular details about particular countries, but there are conversations around how you can help mitigate some of the impact of a particular measure on a particular country if there are good reasons for that. And I think it's a constructive conversation for the most part, and it's a conversation we do collectively with partners. I think the other thing that has been helpful, I think particularly with the Common High Priority Goods List, is it's a perfectly explicable ask both to the experts but also to the populations that what you're trying to do is basically stop stuff that kills people on the battlefield in Ukraine. We're not asking people to stop trading commodity X that has a key impact on their economy. We're asking people to stop selling a particular type of microelectronic or semiconductor which basically turns a dumb missile into a smart missile and kills people. So this is an ask which I don't think is seen as unfair or unrealistic. And again, I think the thing that, again, really helps, to go back to my previous point, is as you've seen other countries comply with it, it makes it harder for people to say, oh, this is far too difficult to do.
Yeah, you've heard me.
Sorry, one last thing. It also helps having US colleagues in the room because there's a certain element of conscious.
Hide behind them.
I think there's a sort of consciousness of some of the levers that the US has in its arsenal, which can be helpful as well, I think, in certain cases.
You've heard me say this before, but I always have this imagination that when you go traveling with the Americans or the EU, whoever says the word sanctions first in country has to buy the drinks that night, because of course you're desperately trying to avoid using that word and keeping it to a very narrow ask, I suppose. Chloe, you have the opportunity to travel around the world and to take the temperature here and there. How would you characterize from what you hear the kind of perception of the UK as a sanctions player, particularly since the independent regime has been implemented?
Well, I did have an opportunity to travel around the world, and pretty much everything that I had planned for 2025 has been, let's hope, put on hold. Some of the projects with RUSI, others with the Financial Services Volunteer Corps. I mean, I think that whole provision of technical assistance, whatever we think about what's going on with the current administration in the US, I think it's really important to bring credibility to, and there's, pushing the compliance side, trying to bring countries that are otherwise not required to implement the sanctions on board, and at least in certain areas, because obviously it's far too much of a big ask to suggest that a country that doesn't have to comply with UK or EU or other sanctions regimes to actually implement them fully. But certainly being in a position to be able to travel and speak to other governments and other key industry players, I think the UK has established itself as an independent sanctions authority, and that in and of itself is good. That was part, I mean, I'm not a Brexiteer, but that was part of the kind of argument as to why we needed to have our own independent sanctions authority. And that certainly has happened. I think the perception is there for good reasons and for bad reasons, because obviously where there is divergence, it is noticeable that the UK is gone off on a frolic of its own, and it's uncomfortable and it's expensive and nobody really understands what's going on. So there's bad publicity. But then, of course, when there is convergence, that obviously shows that, we are a unilateral sanctioning authority, and there is good publicity out there in terms of our alignment and coordinated efforts with the G7. But I think now is a time, we talked about, I think, David, you talked about taking stock. There is an opportunity now to be even stronger and where there are gaps and where there are areas of concern from the private sector, but also from jurisdictions which are wanting to but struggling to. And perhaps there are other pressures coming from the US as well as to why they may or may not want to align with the UK. I think there's an opportunity there to fill those gaps and get out there. And, you know, where State Department has pooled funding, you know, rather than allow another country to actually fill those boots, actually come in as a UK sanctioning authority and say, this is what we can do in terms of providing technical assistance. This is how we can help your companies. This is how we can avoid some of the catastrophic consequences, which is really, you know, Allison, you'll probably talk to this, but I think there's an awful lot of power in the financial sector to make sure that companies comply, more so often than the threat of enforcement action. Because if you have your correspondent banking relationship harmed as a result of a financial institution like HSBC saying, we haven't got the risk appetite to continue to bank you, that is much more harmful for a company, but also for a country at times if the central bank is looking at a number of different private banking relationships which have had their correspondent relationships torn away because they don't have the ability to be able to manage that risk.
Yeah, I mean, I've been struck on some of the trips that we've had the chance to go on, because you're never going. You hear people saying, "Oh, we're worried about getting OFAC'd." All right, that's kind of a verb that has come into the lingua franca. I don't think you're ever going to hear someone saying, "Oh, I'm really nervous about getting off-seed," right? I mean, that's just never going to happen. But well, yeah, fair enough. We'll come to you in a second, Allison. We can put you on the couch. But what was interesting was I think of two particular trips that we had the chance to do, and if everyone to travel internationally, come and work with me. One was in South Africa, and the other was in Mauritius, where actually the conversation revolved around household banking names, half of which were from the United Kingdom, half of which from the United States, and actually the influence that those relationships or maintaining those relationships had on decision making that businesses in those countries were making. So I think the UK actually has more influence. I don't mean the UK government, I mean the UK has more influence than perhaps we sometimes imagine. Now, Allison, we heard it here first. David has committed to have a, but were David to commit to have a sort of a joint writing team or a brainstorming meeting on the next, the updated sanctions strategy at some point, what are the points that you would like to see in there that would help your community and implement the responsibilities that are very firmly placed on you?
Okay, David, I promise this isn't going to be a moan fest, okay? I think I'm just going to, we could probably talk a day, but I'm going to choose a couple of areas I think to focus on. I think strategy guidance, guidance is only as good as the timing of it. So what I mean from that is it needs to be given when it's needed. And I think UK government probably needs to be a little bit more agile at times in providing that guidance. And I'm going to raise the issue, Chloe alluded to it, ownership and control, where I feel as if we've been talking about ownership and control for years, certainly pre-Russia, and we still don't have sufficient clarity around ownership and control. And I think what you end up with there is, and we also have differences across the EU, the UK and the US as to how you even determine ownership, from a simple percentage calculation to control, which is subjective, to difference of approach across the UK industry. And I think you're almost leaving the financial sector at times to determine that somebody is the subject of sanctions, and that can't possibly be effective. It really needs to be a government decision that an entity is subject to sanctions. The impact of that is, and I know for a fact, that there are certain entities within the UK that we as an institution have come to an opinion that they are likely to be controlled by a sanctioned party. And so they're on our filters. We stop their payments. But other institutions within the UK are banking them and are processing the payments. Why do I know that? Because we see them and send them back, or we freeze them. And in sometimes you're reporting that intelligence to government through disclosures and otherwise, and you may be, in the case of some entities, 3 years on nearly, and they're not sanctioned, which therefore exposes my organization to litigation risk because I'm not processing their payments or I'm stopping their payments and other institutions are. So I think we need to come to an agreement and clear clarity around ownership and control. And you certainly also see a huge difference, I think, between the financial sector and how it deals with ownership and control. And obviously we're privy to way more information around our customers and who owns them and the percentage of ownership than maybe a trading company, for example, who probably only screens against the UK lists and is not maybe either subscribing to World Check's 50% or more lists or doing additional due diligence to see who's behind. So you end up with huge inconsistency. So that would be a big ask for us and one that, as I say, has been on the table for several years. And so we need to be more agile in responding to that. I think my other key request would be when we look at the licensing and reporting regime that we now have. So we have OFSI, financial sanctions, we have OTSI, trade sanctions, but not all trade sanctions. So they're going to look at services, and then they're going to look at trade that doesn't leave the UK border, but involves a UK nexus overseas. And then we've got ECJU, the goods that leave in the UK. And then overlay that, we have transactions that the UK government says perfectly permissible, you entity, you can export those goods from the UK, we're fine with that. And then the bank needs a license to process the payment relating to goods that have all, activity that's already been approved by government, and now we're applying for a license, but we only know to apply for a license if our customer comes and tells us that they've got this license in the first place. And often they don't, because they may not know they need to do that. You can go several years before we find out they processed that payment through us. We're now reporting a breach. And in some cases, we now no longer know who we're reporting it to. Is it OTSI? Is it ECGU? Is it everybody? And then you end up with duplicate reporting. And then you also now have FCA, which is also showing a lot more focus on sanctions. And so we may report something to OFSI. We're now also required to report it to FCA. And so you have a lot of duplication in the system, and we only have a finite amount of compliance resources, and they're often tied up with what I might call low-level technical breaches, because our system is not a voluntary reporting scheme as you see in the US. So you can make a decision in the US that you're not going to file a breach report because actually there was no harm to the underlying program, or we're talking about 10 pence. Or the issue was over 10 years ago because the US has a statute of limitations to reporting, previously 5 years, now 10 years. And so we do spend a lot of time trawling through historic records to do a look back. So let's take Libya 2011. Some of our transactional systems, it's really hard to pull out activity that took place in 2011. And you've got to ask, what is the benefit to the policy objectives of the UK government that I'm going to spend a huge amount of my compliance budget, because I do have a budget, trying to pull out transactions from 2011 or reporting a breach to OFSI. By the way, we have done this because it's a mandatory reporting scheme for about £5. It's not really at the heart of the UK policy objective. So that's kind of my small wish list. There are others, but I think those are the ones I'd call out.
Excellent. Thank you very much. John, just turning to you, you touched a little bit on enforcement earlier on. We think of these kind of enforcement actions as kind of teachable moments in theory, although we have kind of curious situations in the UK where we have enforcement action in the form of compound settlements at HMRC, which are not teachable moments because they're kept confidential. But then we have, on the other hand, industry saying, well, you know, you've never bothered to come and visit us in XYZ location in the UK and really teach us and tell us what this is all about. So where's the balance? And have we reached a point on Russia where, you know what, you really should know what you're doing by now and you need to feel the force of the hammer?
I am still slightly disoriented by Allison's update there. That's you should ask about complexity again. With the backdrop of what Allison just said, I think going back to enforcement, of course, there are going to be breaches. I mean, I'm not accusing HSBC, obviously, but if you listen to the string of all the different things that all the controls have to line up, there will be things that go wrong. When enforcement is published, the subset which is published, most banks, everyone I've ever worked with, will read it and understand and looking for the learning points. You know, are we in the same position? Do we do the same thing? Do we have the same client? Do we do those transactions? Do we have a control to stop this? And you usually bring people together and you do some kind of an assessment. I think what's really interesting about the Russian sanctions, and we've discussed this internally for quite some time now, the invasion 3 years ago, if we go back to the first package, people had to understand it, assess it, update your controls, start monitoring, and then you needed a prohibited transaction to take place. And then the additional packages were introduced. Where you or the counterparty institution detects the breach, you then start your investigation, then you qualify it, then you confirm you've got an issue, then you get your lawyer involved, then you get your external counsel involved, then you might do your disclosure, or you do your disclosure, then there's a fact find, and where I'm going with this is, we're 3 years in. I don't think the fact that you don't see a huge wave of enforcement activity now means the world is compliant or people are not doing enforcement. I think it means, is it 388 investigations have been done, David? I think there have been around 380 investigations and 318
obviously
underway.
assure us that there's lots of activity.
Yes. So when we look at enforcement, I think we'll have to remember that it's 3 years, long time, but think of everything that needs to happen for that to be published as an enforcement case. And the learning is there, and the firms are busy responding to inquiries, doing the look back, doing the flow of funds mapping to go to the disclosure and all those kind of things. Does enforcement change things? Yes, it does. Yeah, it does. You have to fix it. You don't want to be the thing. And as Chloe said before, nobody wants to be de-risked because you're a high-risk institution, especially because the regulation requires you do additional due diligence if you're dealing with a sanctioned firm or a firm that's breached that.
Okay, so I want to sort of look forward a little bit because David, you mentioned the review that's going on at the moment. Yeah, there may or may not be an update to the strategy at some point. But I mean, taking everything that's been learned over the last 3 years, maybe you could just talk a little bit about the review, what you see coming down the road in terms of kind of policy, and we'll get on to kind of other topic areas in a second. But like, what should we expect from the review? What do you think the review needs to achieve? So
that's an excellently timed question, because I think it picks up on quite a few things that Allison and John were saying. So just to start off, what I would say, I think the points you made there, Allison, are well taken. And I think all or almost all of those are within scope of the review that we're undertaking at the moment. So the review is basically looking at three main things. One is, how do you make compliance with sanctions easier? Two, how do you increase the deterrent effect of enforcement actions, and how do you focus enforcement on the right areas? And three, how do you expand the overall sanctions toolkit to give you more agility and flexibility? We're in the stage of sort of pulling together, in consultation with industry, with experts, a set of recommendations for ministers, and then ultimately they will need to decide which ones they want to prioritise. But from a sort of personal perspective, a couple of things that John and Allison said sort of jump out to me. One is that I think there's quite a lot we could do to make the guidance simpler and easier to navigate. So I remember I got a phone call on Christmas Day asking for a bit of advice on a sanctions issue, and I really did not want to disturb any of my team. So I thought, right, I'm going to do this myself. And I sort of navigated through the various bits of guidance on, I say, multiple HMG websites and got the answer, but it took me 2 hours. I think I'm somebody who has a reasonable understanding of where to go for this stuff. So I think there's a lot we could do to make things simpler and easier, particularly for sort of the non-financial sector actors. So I think in the UK, we're lucky to have a financial sector that has deep expertise and sophisticated systems for managing compliance. Actually, a lot of what we're doing at the moment is focused on preventing trade in particular types of items. And we're dealing with exporters, distributors, manufacturers, across the UK, who will not necessarily have a deep understanding of sanctions, because this is perhaps the first time they've really had to deal with some of this. I think there's a lot we could do to make the guidance simpler, and also to expand the outreach. So I think one of the areas that I think is important is as the Office of Trade Sanctions implementation gets off the ground, and it's scaling up pretty rapidly. I think the outreach that they are already doing and plan to do, I think, is really important to sort of hit those other sectors. Another area, I think, sort of to John's point, that I think the review will focus on is on enforcement. So one of the things that sort of I'll sort of put an OFSI hat on temporarily. I think one of the things that sort of OFSI has benefited from in the last couple of years is a pretty major increase in personnel and a pretty major increase in resource. And I think if OFSI were here, that they would look forward to the opportunity to do more proactive enforcement. So less of the responding to the reporting that they receive from the financial sector, and more about going after the bad actors. Because I think we are privileged in the UK to have again, to repeat the point, the financial sector that is sort of deeply invested in compliance. What we really need to go after are the bad actors rather than those who've made unwitting or unwilling mistakes. So I think the sort of point on teachable moments is a very fair point. I think even ahead of the review, expect more in terms of detailed guidance to the non-financial sector in terms of the sort of red flags, circumvention methodologies, jurisdictions of concern. I think the bit of guidance that we published a few weeks ago was probably the guidance where I've had the most positive feedback on, because it gave you it gave really actionable stuff. So we need to do more of that. I think that's a long way of saying that a lot of what's come out in the conversation so far is very much within the spirit and the scope of the review, and it's a review that will go at quite a pace, and hopefully we'll get some advice to ministers very soon and a set of recommendations that will get into implementation fairly quickly this year. So I think this is a job for this year rather than next year.
So Chloe, coming back to you and sort of trying to keep looking ahead and beyond Russia, there are obviously, you mentioned, multiple other sanctions regimes out there. So where do these other regimes and the potential for there to be used, or indeed they're already in place and therefore should be being implemented, where do those sit in the minds of the private sector at the moment?
Well, there's always confusion. I think that is probably...
Always Confucius?
Confusion.
Oh, Confucian, sorry.
Yeah.
If in doubt, there's always Confucius.
Given interesting times.
Yeah. No, I was working on a case last week, and I just feel often that I go to, especially the EU consolidated FAQs, which are thematic, which are really user-friendly, and you can go to them having looked at a provision and have a question in your head as to whether or not you've got, the right interpretive stance on a particular restriction, and you can get an answer, and you can come away and go, all right, okay, that's great, and it may not be the answer you want, but you can get an answer. Whereas I find when I go to the Russia guidance or the general financial sanctions guidance, or at the moment I'm looking at something to do with a humanitarian transaction, and I put all of them together, and bearing in mind I'm a UK and an EU lawyer and I should be able to get an answer, I don't get an answer. So I have to call up somebody at OFSI or OTSI and say, mate, what do you think? No, I don't know. Why didn't you write in, and we'll see, and we'll have a look at it. So I think the guidance side of it would be great to improve layer upon layer, so that you can actually, not just in a sort of in a high level way, but allow the technical experts to be able to get the answers that they need, and that they are consistently applied across all of the regimes. So it's not lawyers sitting somewhere in Fleet Street asking themselves whether or not there's a read across. It's actually, no, this applies across all regimes. That would make it, we've got 32, 33, 35 now, regimes. And to know that whatever assessment you're making has cross-application. And that would be really, really helpful. And then I guess, in terms of the private sector and what it's thinking about the other regimes, we've sort of dropped the ball to a certain extent, although there are other, Syria is a regime that everybody's thinking about. But the question there for me, having been in the Foreign Office drafting some of the regulations at the time with Syria, is what are we going to do to dismantle it? And how is that going to be introduced as a concept to the private sector in a way that is effective and it achieves the new foreign policy objectives? Because we've never really been successful about with dismantling the architecture. And we've got a real opportunity, I think, with Syria to demonstrate that you can have these, comprehensive regimes which have far-reaching restrictions, but actually when there is a compelling reason, whether or not we agree with it, in the case of Syria, you can dismantle the architecture and you can promote business activity, which is something we failed to do and I take full responsibility for the Iran failure. We failed to do that in the context of Iran. And all of that work, bringing Iran to the negotiating table, led to nothing. Never mind what happened with Trump. So Syria is a great opportunity to be able to publish the position of what happens when there is effective change, and we are, prepared to move forward and allow, reconstruction efforts or whatever it is with the lifting of sanctions. And I know we touched upon it over the break, but that would be certainly my point.
So Allison, maybe I could come to you and follow up a little bit on that. So obviously, as a bank, you are laser focused on complying with sanctions, making sure that they're implemented. Kind of off ramps or dismantling sanctions. How does that come into the DNA of a bank? Because we've obviously had examples in the past where there have been changes. I'm thinking of the Iran deal, for example. And I remember there was wasn't that famous meeting at UK Finance or BBAs, I think it was, where John Kerry and Boris Johnson turned up and went, "Come on, chaps, let's go," or worse that effect. And as it was Boris, that's probably exactly what he said. I mean, how do you think about the changing, the downgrading of sanctions like that?
Well, we tend to, and Iran's a good one because you're right, the US went around telling everybody that they could go and do business with Iran, and that's backfired in the past. We don't just look at it from a single sanctions perspective. We're looking at the broader financial crime risks that a country may or may not present. And so it's not sometimes just simply looking to say, okay, there's UK sanctions or there's US sanctions. Our risk appetite in dealing with the jurisdiction is much broader than that. And we will look and make risk appetite decisions based on a whole array of issues, sanctions being just one of them.
So I want to ask you, and then John, I'd like you to come in on this as well. So when we had the panel discussion yesterday, David O'Sullivan made an observation, which is that when he hears people talk about sort of the red flag indicators related to sanctions evasion, so on, they sound quite a lot like anti-money laundering red flags. And he posed the question, which we never really answered, which is, when are we going to get to a point, or have we got to a point yet between those two poles where financial institutions sort of think about risk and not in the sort of different silos of sanctions and AML or fraud? You hinted at it there, but maybe you could expand on that.
Oh, we most definitely do. I mean, a couple of years back, we used to have a global AML policy, a global fraud policy, a global sanctions policy, a global ABC policy. And about 3 years ago, we collapsed them into a global financial crime policy. And so rather than saying, when you're onboarding a customer, think about these things for sanctions. When you're onboarding a customer, think about these things from an AML perspective. We actually have reorganized our policy so that you kind of follow the life cycle, as it were. And so when these are the things that you need to do when you are onboarding for the customer for across all of those financial crime risk disciplines. And fraud is very much a part of that for us. I know there's different approaches taken by different institutions as to where fraud sits. With us, it sits very much as part of the financial crime family. And so we take a financial crime perspective. We have multiple teams, but we have a financial crime investigations team that is not siloed. So you don't have some investigators looking at sanctions, some investigators looking at AML. They look at financial crime across the board. So that's been very much the journey that we've been on over the last sort of 3 or 4 years.
Claire, I can feel itching to come in.
I just don't think, I think HSBC is probably further ahead.
Well, this is the question I was going to ask.
Yeah, because I started at HSBC in 2016, and as painful as it was, because they didn't want to transact with Iran, which was kind of what I built my career on. I could see why they didn't do that. But you are further ahead. But I would say certainly my last couple of years at Deutsche Bank, and a lot of it has been triggered by regulatory scrutiny, if you're under a sort of a monitorship or some other form of remediation, but also, executive orders like EO 14114 drove the or triggered the initiative within financial institutions that you need to think more broadly about how you adapt your controls in order to manage not just the sanctions risk, but you rely on all of the other controls that you have within your toolbox.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, you are also starting, we've always talked about sort of the sanctions controls being the real-time controls. So stop the payment as it is, identify the customers, you onboard them or they become sanctioned. But I think you're also, and you have to see, the big focus from the UK and others is around sanctions evasion. Now, you're not going to identify a evasion by stopping a single transaction, because unless somebody's told me this entity is evading sanctions, in which case it's the same as any other. I'll stick it on the filter, we'll stop their payments. But evasion is identified through much more of what we might call the traditional AML transaction monitoring controls. And so we're spending quite a bit of time at the moment thinking around how we use what were those traditional typologies from an AML perspective to actually identify sanctions evasion or export control evasion. So I think you are seeing that shift. You have to see that shift.
Okay. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions in a second. So hopefully Gonzalo is ready with the microphone. But John, you have a range of clients. How would you think that the notion is that HSBC is more advanced than most? Are there any horror stories you can tell us about the way others perhaps are operating?
There are, and I'm going to say something a bit outrageous, which is HSBC is more advanced than a lot of firms.
Oliver Wyman also was our independent consultant for a while.
There's a horrible conflict of interest going on in front of me.
Thank you, Dan. I think one of the points about weaknesses is organizational, because you said something really important then about how you deal with alerts. And some of the firms we're talking with now are looking at their operating model and organization design, because they've got these stovepipes of people who investigate certain alerts or certain fraud events, certain potential sanctions, export control challenges, and so on. And what's interesting, and it's partly driven by the technology, machine learning, AI type issues, which is we don't know what the crime is, and we don't know what they're doing that may culminate in a breach. We know they're doing this, they're progressing this outcome in an anomalous way. They are acting differently. Why is that? So you're getting this hybrid team, which just gets an alert, and then they start to investigate it. And the skill set's slightly different. And to the point where, like, where's the weakness? The firms that have got 50 people checking everything on a list that hit a specific rule, I'm not sure they're going to be agile. I'm not sure they're going to pick up on the professional circumvention. And when we were speaking about threats earlier on, Tom, one of the things I'm kind of curious about is circumvention as a service, in the same way that crypto laundering is a service out in North Korea. If you look at China, India, and so on, that wasn't an allegation, by the way, but circumvention as a service, professional enablers in there, the shell companies on demand, or digital assets with a perceived value that's far in excess of as a service, all those kind of things. I think anomaly detection and a hybrid approach to it is probably the only way you'll do that, not a rule-based way to do it. If you have a classical transaction monitoring system and you install the out-of-a-box 110 scenarios and you strip away the ones that aren't relevant to you, you're looking for more instances of something that we all know about that's happened before, which is informed by a series of red flags. And I don't think they're necessarily the same red flags that they used to be.
Okay. So, David, I say we'll come to questions after this. Obviously, we've seen some sanctions activity in the UK of late. For example, on anti-corruption, we've seen the announcement of the ambition on organised immigration crime sanctions. We've seen action from the new US president on Iran and shadow fleet. We saw, I think, yesterday some cyber-related sanctions. So obviously, the kind of the sanctions business is open beyond Russia right now. So what would you kind of have us think about when we're planning our work here, or whatever Allison has to do at HSBC, or John is talking to clients about? Because it's not just Russia, Russia, Russia anymore, which obviously it was for a period, or at least it seemed like it was.
So I'd probably pull out sort of 2 or 3 areas. I think Russia will remain a focus. It will remain a focus because there are some real vulnerabilities in the Russian economy, which I think are exploitable. The US-UK package that targeted shadow fleet oil majors, etc., in January, that had an impact. There's more we can do. But outside of Russia, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think the sanctions directorate is open for business. Where I think there are sort of up arrows from the current government, I would say, are on anti-corruption, kleptocracy. And again, sort of sanctions is one tool in a much bigger toolkit to go after corrupt actors. But the sort of packages that we saw against notorious kleptocrats or against gold smuggling, I think there's more to come in that sort of space. I think sanctions can have a genuinely disruptive impact if you go after, for example, the enablers that support those corrupt actors. So that was the sort of philosophy behind some of the recent packages. And I think that's where there is a clear focus from government to go further. I think the other area where there is a big interest is on organised immigration crime. And again, one tool in a much bigger toolkit, but there are some areas where I think applying some of the lessons we've learned from our cyber actions, for example, you can have quite a disruptive impact if you choose the right sort of targets, but expect a sort of rapid development of that regime over the coming months and some packages there. I'd pull out cyber again. I mean, yes, you mentioned yesterday's package with the US and Australia. That went after both the perpetrators of cyber attacks, but also some of the infrastructure they use. And again, I think, I mean, there's a bit of a theme here around sort of non-state actors. So we've talked a lot about sort of state actors, Russia, et cetera. I think where there is potentially up arrows are on some of those non-state actors, whether it's kleptocrats, ransomware, criminals, or those connected with organised immigration crime. And then there will clearly be a sort of whole host of other geopolitical challenges that we'll need to look at, sanctions being an appropriate tool or not to deal with.
So just to follow up on that, obviously you mentioned the increased staffing of OFSI. I think you've had a few extra staff over the last 2 or 3 years as well. There are sanctions like anti-corruption sanctions, which were on the books in the UK before February 2022. So what lessons has the sanctions community on Whitehall learned over the last 3 years that might make the approach to something like anti-corruption sanctions look different today than it did pre-Feb 22?
So let me circle back to the very start of this session. So the strategy a year ago set out sort of 3 main principles that we would follow. We were going to use sanctions to deter malign activity, disrupt malign activity, or demonstrate our abhorrence for certain behaviours. I think one of the things that we have focused on over the last couple of years has been really putting emphasis on that disrupt space. So in the Russia context, for example, it's been very much around disrupt, constrain. I personally am a strong believer in sort of quality over quantity. And I think a small number of really carefully selected sanctions that target, for example, some of the financial enablers that have been allowing and enabling Russian sanctions circumvention, or going after the enablers or networks that are supporting laundering of corrupt proceeds. I think that's the sort of area where we can really add value. So I think there's a choice about when you use them quite selectively, and sometimes these cases take a lot longer to build because they come with complexities, corporate structures, legal risk. But I think sort of moving away from, any sense of a numbers game into something which is much more focused on impact.
Right, we have some time for questions. So I gave you a lot of warning, so I hope they're going to be good questions coming. I'll come to Ellie here. If you could just say where you're from, particularly if you're a journalist, Eleanor.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Myers. I'm from Politico. My question is for David. Some of Britain's overseas territories have been accused of aiding sanctions evasion and hiding the money of kleptocrats. I'd be interested to hear what the Foreign Office wants in sort of a change in behaviour from the overseas territories.
Let's take that one first.
So I think the overseas territories are a key part of our engagement. So the overseas territories have frozen a lot of assets in relation to Russia sanctions. They've done some pretty extraordinary stuff, often with them. I think we've been focused in terms of how we can sort of build the capability and capacity across the overseas territories to implement and enforce sanctions. I think that's a big priority for this government, and we'll continue to work with the overseas territories to help them tackle those challenges.
So you did say overseas territories. A lot of people lump the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories together, and I think it's important that people look at these jurisdictions individually, because it'd be remiss of me not to highlight a very important event that happened on Sunday night or Monday morning, which was that the FATF mutual evaluation of Guernsey was published. And if you look at both the Guernsey evaluation and the Jersey evaluation, and if you are a dedicated follower and worshipper of the Financial Action Task Force, those reports actually make a virtue out of the work that Jersey and Guernsey have done on implementing sanctions against Russia. So this is my personal view, but I actually think that there are things that those jurisdictions can do to help work with the overseas territories. I say they often get put in the same bucket together, which is not accurate. They are on a scale, a spectrum. So I would just look at those as well, because I think they definitely need more resource. I've had the opportunity to visit places like the BVI, and that they have a lot to do, and they don't have the resources to do it. But I think some of the, if you like, the UK's financial network and infrastructure around the world has actually been doing a pretty impressive job. There was a question somewhere. Oh, you had your hand up. Yeah, sorry, sir, come here.
So, Chris Daniels, I'm a research into grey zone warfare at Oxford, and I'm also a former investment banker. Thanks for the talk. What I got out of it was that there was some kind of new creation of policy around sanctions, and that there was a reasonably robust implementation of that framework. What I didn't get from the talk was what's the success of all of this and what's the metrics. And what I read daily is there's still a lot of finance going into Russia, and there's still a lot of weaponry that's being utilized. And can all the panel say something about the metric of success and whether all of this work, hard work, has been successful, or has it just sort of pushed the problem into other parts of the world?
So I'll give David the last word, because I think I know what he's going to say. So maybe just a line from each.
I'm going to utilise two things that I've learned from other speakers on this particular point. One is David O'Sullivan, and the other is a lot of the stuff that's come out of the Kiev School of Economics. And I've also had Ukrainians living with me for a couple of years, and I get their view directly from almost, I want to say, the battlefield. And all three seem to be aligned, which is that there's the perception part of it, which is obviously really important, and that goes without saying for all sanctions regimes, that the people know that you are there supporting them against whatever it is that they are facing. But in terms of metrics, I think especially from the Kiev School of Economics, it's about slowing down Russia's ability. And there is not an awful lot of material out there which has demonstrated that Russia would be much further in terms of achieving its military objectives had these sanctions not been in place, whether it's about the goods that they cannot access immediately and at more expensive prices, because we just have to look at what the trade routes are now, and also having less revenue to be able to spend on the military exercises. And there's a huge amount of metrics which supports that. Of course, they're still making progress, but not as fast as they would have done.
I think before you come in, I think I'd just pick up on something that that David said, which was that we had a sort of game of bingo in 2022, which was how hyperbolic will the Foreign Secretary's statements about sanctions on Russia be in the latest announcement. And I had a number of conversations with colleagues of David before he was there, who said, don't blame us for the kind of the language in the press releases, because it set expectations too high. And indeed, I think many senior leaders in sort of the late 21, early 22 period misrepresented what sanctions are going to achieve. And I think we've had to walk back that a lot. But Allison, anything you'd like to say on that point?
Let's say about metrics. But one of the challenges, well, one of the internal conversations we're having is around how you better make sure that the information you're giving to law enforcement is actually useful. So looking at the quality of suspicious activity reporting and trying to work out, is there a metric for saying actually that was a quality SAR that we filed versus actually no good to the person that's taking it and receiving it. So that is an area that we're currently looking at, and that's actually one of also a recent Wolfsburg principle for auditors around looking to make sure that you're to seek to provide useful information to law enforcement.
John, anything to?
Very briefly, at a national level, I would use the same report that Chloe just referred to, the KSC reports. Something they published recently was about the tax take on businesses and where the imports come from. That's a very useful piece. At a obliged entity level, Allison referred earlier on to how to treat a payment that shouldn't be processed necessarily. Metrics such as suspense accounts, amounts of interdicted payments, those kind of things are key. But what's interesting is if you get a payment and you move it to another account, that would be an offence because you can't move it. But equally, you can't put it in a suspense account. But equally, you just have to look after it. And there are metrics like that that make success and compliance by obliged firms quite a difficult thing to measure. And again, you said at the beginning of your question about the news says the news is only going to tell you about the breaches, not the good compliance. So
I'd say a couple of things. I would say in terms of the metrics, we're basically trying to measure two things. One is how much less revenue does Russia get as a result of sanctions? I mean, Russia has been denied more than $400 billion that would have otherwise been available. And the counterfactual where this money would have been available to Russia to wage war, you can imagine the sort of scenarios. And you can deny Russia access to revenues in a whole range of ways. I think just putting out one of the most recent packages, the UK-US action against energy majors in January I mentioned. If you look at how the discount between Brent and Urals has changed since then, and also for the first time how China and Russian refineries are denying access to designated vessels, this is quite a big deal in terms of revenues. So more to do, but a pretty big impact there. The second point, which is I think harder to really get into the detail on, is on the military supply chains. So there, I mean, I agree with Chloe, you cannot suppress import of goods to zero, but what you can do is make it more expensive, slower, lower quality, more complicated, and you can measure all of those things. So particularly on, for example, machine tools, which we know Russia is particularly dependent on certain supply routes. Russia is paying 3 times as much for what it was paying previously. It's getting stuff much slower, and it is getting, for example, on the microelectronics side, much lower quality goods. So you can measure all of this using a whole range of methods. This is about basically putting as much sand in the gears as possible. And you're absolutely right that as you sort of push down trade in one area through one route, it will pop up elsewhere. That's inevitable. That's how this will work. And this was entirely foreseeable. It's a game of whack-a-mole, but if you make that whack-a-mole as expensive as possible for the Russians, that's success.
So we can continue discussion over lunch in a second, but I think I would just make a final observation, which is that, and I think you would possibly agree with me, David, which is that we haven't done a good job of demonstrating the impact of sanctions. I think we can do more work to demonstrate that. If you want to demonstrate the impact of sanctions, you have to look in lots of different areas. We were having a conversation about the impact of the 10 January designations on vessels and so on and so forth, and looking at the work that Simon over there and Kurt Winwood do. And you can see the impact, but the man in the street is not subscribing as much as I'm sure Winwood would like them to, not subscribing to their tools and looking at that religiously. So I think there are areas where you can see the impact, but we haven't sort of pooled it together in a communications strategy which makes it clear that the working and the strategic communications war is actually quite important, because there are countries around the world which are being told by the Russians, oh, your bread price has gone up because of Western sanctions. Well, hang on a minute. Let's drill into what's really happening. But as soon as you have to try and explain something to somebody and it doesn't just go on the front page of the newspaper, I mean, you know, arguably the person who's done the most for suggesting that sanctions don't work is, well, I won't say his name, but anyway, a reporter at Sky News who loves doing stories about, you know, Rolls-Royce cars and so on. Fact, that's happening. Or the recent coverage of Bloomberg in Japan about grand pianos, but they're not dropping grand pianos out of MiG jets, right? And so what we should be focusing on is trying to aggregate this impact information and then presenting it in a way that it is digestible by the media that are setting the narrative. So I'm going to end it there because Hasuna is waving at me to say that lunch is ready. But thank you all very much indeed for your time. John, thank you for your insights on Oliver Wyman. David, as ever, it's a kind of a pleasure to have you come across the road, be with us. Allison, thank you too. And Sonic Screwdriver, Chloe, thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you all.